Rachel. It's my pleasure to welcome Rachel Carnegie, to our evening together. Rachel is an Anglican priest and the director of the Anglican Alliance, which is part of the Anglican Communion. And I think it's a wonderful organization. I think the hopes and dreams of the Alliance are similar to the ones we have in Christians Aware, but you have a wide reach across the Anglican Communion, and that is wonderful. I think I'm right in saying the idea is that the Alliance offers resources and works as an example for all the provinces of the Communion, so that more work can go on than is actually done by the Alliance itself. So it's pump priming, it's educational, but it is a development agency working for the ending of poverty, working for the environment, and recently in support of victims of the COVID as well. But you'll hear more from Rachel. Many of us will remember Elizabeth Perry, who's one of your colleagues who spoke at our conference in January. And you may remember, those of you who were there, that she spoke on health and healing. And I remember words like wholeness and communion and linking and nourishing. It was most inspiring, and I think it does represent what the Anglican Alliance stands for. I read an article this afternoon, actually, and the heading for the article was God's Church for God's World. And I think that sums it up and is a wonderful heading for any organization. God's Church for God's World. Welcome, Rachel, and thank you.
Barbara, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And we've known each other for many years indeed. And
Yes.
Greetings from Elizabeth, who much enjoyed being with you at the conference earlier this year.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad that I can join you today. And it's also a treat to have other really good friends here on the call. I mean, I look forward to our conversation later, but Sue Parks has been an inspiration for me for many, many years. I think we first met Sue in South Africa in 2007, when Sue was preparing to run the Lambeth Conference in 2008, which was indeed where the Anglican Alliance was first conceived. And also want to just greet Sister Pamela, who saw me through a month's silence. I was up on the island of Mull, around the corner from Sister Pamela, and she was my spiritual director for an Ignatian retreat of a month's silence. So it's really special to have these links already. So thank you for inviting me. I've been asked by Barbara to speak more generally on the ministry and mission of the Anglican Alliance, and to give you an overview, but also to share something about what's called the Communion Forest, which is an initiative that we launched out of the recent Lambeth Conference, which was last year. So I'm going to share a few slides, and please feel free, if you want to ask a question as I go along, please just jump in. But otherwise, Barbara's asked me to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then to have some discussion thereafter. Is that right, Barbara? Yes, perfect, good. Well, let me bring up the slides then. Here we are, the Anglican Alliance. This is one of my favorite pictures, but also terribly poignant. This is a photograph I took in Burma, in Myanmar, back in 2019. And it was about how local churches are working with their communities to study scripture, think about what it means to be a place of hope and a source of light and transformation in their communities in very practical ways. And this was some of the community women with their facilitator who had come together and just found such joy and excitement. And what they had done is looked at the needs in their communities and For instance, one real thing was about access for people who had mobility problems through the muddy tracks. So they'd created these tracks to the village that were accessible and were constantly thinking about what they could do to bring hope and help to their neighbours. And I put this here because, of course, tragically and appallingly, 6 months later was the coup in Myanmar. And so this for me is always a reminder of the human spirit and human resilience, but also the evils and tragedies and injustices that we have in our world. I do know that this community actually is all right, that the work they've done has given them this kind of resilience to continue even under the terrible conditions now. But this is about the Alliance, about being connected, about being one body across the world so that nobody and no community is left alone at times of difficulty. So this is the Anglican Alliance, and we work to connect and inspire the worldwide Anglican family. I'm working for a world, as Barbara said, free of poverty and injustice and safeguarding creation. So we're not like Christian Aid, we're not a funding agency. Our job is about sharing the skills, the expertise, the vision, and the resources around the worldwide Anglican Communion, but also working ecumenically and, where possible, also interfaith, bringing the faith family together to tackle the challenges that we all face. And I love the title. God's Church for God's World was the title for the Lambeth Conference last year. And it gives us a very outward-looking focus, which is so important at a time when the church is also riven with internal tensions and conflicts. This is what Archbishop Justin said, that the Alliance reflects the gospel priority of a bias for the poor. And I like this photo. This is Archbishop Justin with a former child slave from Ghana. And this was an event at the Vatican that brought all the faith leaders together, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Hindu, and so on, all committing their faith communities to tackling and seeking to end modern slavery. And I'll tell you more about this young man, James, slightly later. This is the Anglican Alliance. So we have a team that is spread right across the communion. And that's the real joy that we, especially in this day and age of meeting online as we're doing now, that you really can work as a global team in very close collaboration. So each of these really wonderful colleagues around the communion then has their own regional forum that they work together, bringing together all the churches in that region. And then they also work with what we call communities of practice, which are, let's say, on the environment or tackling modern slavery, promoting safe migration. They then work with those groupings within their own regions to really share skills and build both partnerships and capacity. So we also have a board of trustees that come from across the communion and are in touch with churches across the 165 countries. And we work within this framework, and I almost want Sue to read this. I wonder, Sue, if you would unmute and just read the Anglican Marks of Mission, because this, I think, might be stenciled on you.
So the marks of mission in the Anglican Communion: to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind and pursue peace and reconciliation, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth.
Thank you, Sue. These were first created back in the 80s, but have really gained momentum across the global communion because they express the totality of what it is to proclaim the good news in word and in action. And at the Alliance, we're very passionate about holding all of these together, that when we're responding to human need or challenging unjust structures or safeguarding the integrity of creation, that's about good news as well. It's about the gospel as it's lived, as well as preached. And also it's about whole life discipleship, what number 2 is about. It's about people living out their faith in ways that bring hope to the poorest and most vulnerable and most marginalized. So this is the structure, and increasingly across the worldwide church, national churches are building their own mission imperatives around these marks of mission. So just looking at these, I just wanted to give you some examples of work that we've been involved with. So here's an example of the first mark of mission about proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. And I gave you that example at the beginning of the church in Burma and Myanmar, where they were working on what's called local community, church and community transformation. So this is an approach that builds on the assets, the skills, the gifts, the vision of the local church and community. And this is growing in popularity as an approach for local mission right across the communion. And in this instance, we have a pairing of the church in the Diocese of Jerusalem. So this is churches in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, in Jordan, Lebanon. And they have come on exchange visit to Northern Ireland, who are also following this approach, sharing what they're learning about what it is to be good news in your context. And in this case, sharing what it is to be good news in a place of historic and in some cases contemporary conflict. And I love in the middle this man, Father George, who is a Jordanian Anglican priest there, and he runs a church which is absolutely bursting at the seams with Iraqi refugees, and just the most amazing ministry in the poorest part of Amman. Here we are back again in Myanmar, nurturing discipleship. And I just wanted to home in on the wonderful woman who's laughing her head off. She said that she had been so shy to talk in church, even, to express herself in any way. But through this kind of process of looking at scripture and saying, what's God's calling for me? What's God's calling for us together? She'd gained this kind of confidence and started leading Bible discussions, and then thinking about what kind of response the church could make with neighbours in the wider community to help people who are most vulnerable in their community. So nurturing whole life discipleship. Responding to human need by loving service. This is the third of the marks of mission. I love this photograph here. This is Anna in South Sudan near Juba. And I first went out there and met Anna in early 2014, just after the conflict had restarted in South Sudan. And at that point, she was that's not this photograph, this was later, in a really desperate situation. Her husband and many others had been murdered, and she and her two tiny children had fled down the Nile. But when they arrived in this place, about 30 of them, the Mothers' Union, so the women from the local church, just put together whatever they could manage to bring food, to bring clothing, to bring help and shelter to this group of women fleeing violence, fleeing the horror of seeing their loved ones murdered. And I went back again 5 months later, and this was Anna and her children in a way really restored. And the Mothers' Union had continued to help them, but then the Alliance's work had been to get alongside and bring resources from around the communion to help this little community of internally displaced people and others around South Sudan. Barbara mentioned about the pandemic. When it started in early 2020, we had to sort of turn on a sixpence and focus all our programs on responding to the pandemic. And what became apparent was, as we were in touch with all these different parts of the communion through the regional forums, was that everybody successively was affected, but in different ways and with deep, deep inequalities. And you'll be all too aware of things like the injustice of vaccine distribution around the world, the horrors of places with dense populations where they lacked the oxygen to keep people alive. It was a very, very dark and difficult time, but also a place where you saw light in the darkness. And for the Alliance, it was just astonishing. We were in touch, learning first of all from the churches in East Asia, who'd been the first to experience the pandemic. How are you coping? What are you doing to keep safe and to keep supporting the most vulnerable in your areas? And a lot of feeding programs went on, like this one in North India, but also extraordinary work like the young people in Myanmar who helped in the young Anglicans helped in the quarantine centres, supporting the more elderly people who were very sick with COVID. What did the Alliance do? Well, we formed very quickly a global task force that met weekly for 2 years and then continued for the third. And we held over 30 global and regional consultations to learn from the church. What are you doing? How to respond? What's the best practice? What are some of the difficulties you're facing, like vaccine hesitancy and so on? And we developed a very extensive resource hub online in 4 languages. As the pandemic moved on, things like the vaccine issue became a primary issue to help people understand and talk about important questions they might have about the vaccine, to challenge misinformation, and to work as a communion, bringing together our government relations offices to really work with the governments to talk about vaccine equity, to make sure as far as we could that the vaccines were being distributed properly. And of course about praying together, sharing hope together. And this little drawing kind of really expresses it all, that although the church closed, the building closed, that the church was still open because it's the people of God. And during that time, we saw remarkable things. I've talked about this asset-based approach before in a couple of examples. The top one is an example from the church in the Philippines, where they realized that the garment workers were out of work and had been laid off. And so they employed them and got them making the protective equipments, masks and aprons and so on. So they were turning the skills of these people to make livelihoods during that time. The picture below is just a happier time in 2019 when we were in Myanmar before the coup, but had gathered people from across the region to share what they were doing in this form of local church and community transformation. But thinking about other places where we've been involved in responding to human need, on the humanitarian response, these are just some of the places over the last couple of years where we've been involved. And even just yesterday, we had a call with the church in DR Congo, with the Archbishop and some of the development teams there. Amazing people. Sue, you'll know them, people like the Soke and Archbishop Ande Teach, who are working there. And through decades of conflict and being really lost to the international media, they've continued to be shepherds to their sheep in the most terrible situation, where even the camps for displaced people are being attacked. But they remain faithful, they remain bringing help and hope. And the job of the Alliance is to bring their story and to bring their needs to the attention of the wider communion and try to enable resources to flow into the church so they can do things like trauma healing, working with women who have been sexually abused, and even basic things of hope through food and water and shelter. So some of those places may be on your hearts, and do ask me more about them later. Okay, so in this, as I said, it's about coordinating the humanitarian relief so that funds can flow through to the church so they can respond. And the Alliance does that in a coordinated way. So the church just has to write one plan, one proposal, one set of reports. And then the Alliance works with all the different agencies around the communion to then share and coordinate that plan and get the support for it. But what we have recognized over the years is that you can continue to work on a humanitarian response, but what's so important is to build the resilience, to build the preparedness of churches and their communities to face disasters, so that when they come, they will be more resilient. So during the pandemic, we started and have now continuing what we called the resilience course. And this was a 12-month online course, training people across the communion, sharing their skills of different experiences of how churches can be prepared and more resilient in practical, spiritual, psychosocial ways to meet disasters that come. And there's a toolkit that we developed with the American Episcopal Church aid agency called Episcopal Relief and Development, called Pastors and Disasters. A nice title. But this, I'll give you one example. This is the resilience work in Tonga, which is right over, as you'll know, in the Pacific. There, it really much focused on young people, and they decided that they would be prepared should a disaster happen. And I find it the most extraordinarily encouraging story. They put together the little resource they could get, which was $200. And with that, they bought a series of packages of biscuits and tuna and matches and candles and some water. And this is like an emergency pack should there be a disaster. And then what they did is went around their communities and mapped on satellite mapping the households that were really vulnerable. So where there might be elderly people or somebody with a disability, where they would need help in a time of crisis. Unbelievably, I was talking about this example back in late 2021. And then shortly after that was the volcano that went off in Tonga and the tsunami. And this very group of people, you can see them here, as the tsunami left, they were then out in their communities and they took around those packages to help those families in need. Because of this great example, there's been a lot of resource now coming through from the Communion, which the Alliance helped to coordinate, to actually ensure that the recovery phase with these brilliant young people and their church leaders has gone well. And because this disaster happened during the pandemic, they didn't have any outsiders, any specialists coming in. They did it all themselves. And it's a really superb example of a church being resilient. And finally, on this area of responding to human need is our work that we do, climate change, poverty, disasters, conflict, all forcing people on the move. And we can talk about this later, and indeed, what's going on in our own context. But one of the things that happens when people are on the move is they become very at risk of human trafficking, of being sold into modern slavery. So we've done a lot of work around the Communion, learning from some churches that are already working on this, but especially actually from the Salvation Army, who turned out to be absolutely expert in understanding the dynamics of modern slavery. And so we've done these training events in all the different regions around the Communion, and now have these what we call communities of practice of Salvation Army and Anglicans and some Roman Catholics and others who all join together to look at how can the church make people aware of human trafficking, how can they know the signs of it so that they can intervene and know where to go for help. So this is bringing me back to that young man I showed you with Archbishop Justin Welby at the beginning, called James. Six years old. His parents were told that he and his 5 other boys would be taken off to go to school. They weren't. They were sold into slavery on Lake Volta in Ghana. And this is a man-made lake which has trees underwater still. And the nets of the fishing boats get caught in the trees, and so they use little children to dive down and free the nets from the trees. And the nets are worth $200, and James was sold for $25. So the children are seen as expendable. It's just cruelty beyond imaginable. But 3 of James's friends taken from the village drowned quite soon. James survived till he was 13 and then managed to run away. And he couldn't go home because the traffickers would chase him. So he went to Accra, to the capital, and managed to work and get an education right up to degree level, to get a job and then raise enough money to set up a small charity called Challenging Heights that now works specifically to educate about trafficking and rescue the children from the lake in their fishing slavery. But the thing is, it's everywhere. And I was down in my village where I grew up in Wiltshire 2-3 years ago, and before the pandemic. And I was just tending my parents' grave, and it was really beautiful. I was just thinking, this is such a contrast to what I hear about during my day job. And a few days later, on the news, I just heard a little snippet about 2 little boys from Vietnam who'd been found in a cannabis enslaved in a cannabis factory in a Wiltshire village. And blow me down, it was actually about a mile from where I had been in the village graveyard. And they'd been in, this particular village has some quarries, underground quarries, and the traffickers had set up a cannabis factory in the quarries, and these little boys have been under there for 2 years. Eventually, the villagers suddenly realised there were strange noises of trucks at night and called the police, and that's how they managed to catch and free the boys. But it is a phenomenon of evil and corruption and greed that is everywhere in our world. In the Church of England, we actually have a very good initiative called the CLUA initiative that's working with churches to raise awareness about modern slavery and equip churches to see the signs and know where to get help. So, moving on. The fourth mark of mission is about challenging the unjust structures of society. We do this in a number of ways, but one of the ways is working on climate justice. And we work with the Anglican UN team and the Anglican Environment Network in bringing together policy papers for the climate COP, so the UN summits on climate. There's also summits on biodiversity and so on, but these particular ones have been, we've had Anglican delegations there at the last 3, and looking at particular policy issues that have risen to the fore in our own research and discussions around the communion. And one of them is about just financing. And I've just come back recently from the Pacific. This photo actually here is from Vanuatu. It's one of the Franciscan brothers there. And the just financing is about recompensing those countries like the Pacific Islands who, by no fault of their own, they haven't been responsible for climate change, and yet they're facing rising waters, salination of their soils, and overwhelming of some of their communities through climate change. So the financing is about ensuring that the loss and damage due to climate change is being recompensed, and that countries are being helped to adapt and mitigate the impact of climate change, but also being supported to transition themselves to clean energy. We work right across on tackling inequalities. So we have a lot of conversation and theological discussion about what does it mean to be a church built on colonialism, and what are its manifestations today. But we also look at sort of generational justice and do a lot of work with the youth leadership and the newly reformed youth network around the communion. They were, for example, were the first ones to be made redundant in the pandemic. Young people were much more likely to be losing their jobs than older people. So we're doing some work around livelihoods opportunities. Also working with gender justice and all those issues around gender-based violence. And also a particular piece of work, a real privilege of this job, is getting to know the Anglican Indigenous Network and the extraordinary insights that they have about a number of issues, but including how humanity relates to creation as a whole, and how much of the world thinks of nature as something to be exploited. But in an Indigenous perspective, we live as part of creation in a deep, interconnected and interdependent way. And so their theology, and they've done the Indigenous Network have done a beautiful series of videos and theological reflections, has been absolutely at the heart of our climate and wider environmental response. So here's an example. Here is some of the work going. This was in Glasgow, and on the far left, you can see the Archbishop Julio Murray from Panama, and there they are with an interfaith group working on demands for climate justice. And finally, as we segue from justice issues to safeguarding creation and renewing the life of the earth. I just wanted to give some examples here. So here's Archbishop Justin launching the Communion Forest at the Lambeth Conference last year. And the Archbishop of Kenya there on the right, who actually was the inspiration for much of this. Their church, the Anglican Church in Kenya, is working with the government to plant 2 billion trees. They've been given areas of forest to protect and to restore. He models it by every year planting the number of trees of his age. So a week last Monday, he planted 59 trees because he's just turned 59. But they also have some remarkable work with a huge forest they've been given to care for by the government, where they go for prayer walks around the forest with water and just stop and water the saplings and pray about the protection of the forest. So the advocacy on this work, again, you can see the link there from the piece outside where they're campaigning alongside others, to actually having the delegation inside what's known as the blue zone, which is actually the negotiating zone for the climate conferences, able to engage with governments and to work ecumenically and in interfaith terms to bring the voice of faith into the heart of the global negotiations. So just to reflect finally on the Lambeth Conference last year, which one of the calls, as it were, almost like the resolutions that came out of the conference, was on environment and sustainable development. And that now continues in what's known as phase 3 of the conference, which is more online engagement. But one of the legacies of last year's conference was and is the Communion Forest. So I'll just end this talk by just sharing something about the forest. There we are. It's about that 5th mark of mission, about sustaining and renewing the life of the earth. But also, this being launched as we came out of the pandemic, we felt that the quote from Revelation 22, 2 especially, about the leaves of the tree in the kingdom of God, the leaves of the tree being for the healing of the nations. So we know that people can't flourish without nature, without all of creation flourishing. So the forest, this is something that the Anglican Alliance is working on with the Anglican Environment Network, and also the rather wonderfully called eco-bishops, who are bishops around the Communion, really passionate about the environment. So what we're seeking to do is promote forest and ecosystem, other ecosystem protection and restoration across the Communion. So it might be forests that need to be protected, like the Amazon or the rainforests in Congo and in the Philippines and so on. But it might similarly be mangrove swamps at the edge of the coast to try and protect the coastline from inundation. Or indeed in America, there are 6 dioceses there working on prairie restoration. So whatever one's ecosystem, this project is about how do we protect it, conserve it, and restore it if it's been damaged. And also, as well as the practical action, to provide resources that weave this creation care into the spiritual life of local churches. And this rather lovely logo was designed for us with the Tree of Life, but it has the number of leaves for the number of provinces of the Anglicans around the Communion. And here are some of the responses. It was building on what was already happening. So we've been learning from existing initiatives, like the lovely picture in the middle of the little girls in India. So they've had green schools in South India and a real commitment to environmental issues for a number of years. But some of these initiatives now are gathering massive momentum. And one thing in particular that bishops have done is taken from Lambeth the idea that every confirmation that they do, they give saplings. Down at the bottom, you can see Bishop Graham of Norwich with his hazel saplings that he grows in a nursery at the bishop's house and gives out for each candidate for confirmation. And that's a symbolic piece, but then also you can see, for example, with the person in the yellow suit, that's in Zimbabwe, where they are doing a massive tree planting program on church lands. And below that in the Amazon is a nursery that they've developed. And you can see the prairie restoration there with the man with the long grass. So a number of responses, but all of them responding in their own context. So we have a small team, which the Alliance resources and is led by the Alliance and the Environment Network, supporting practical action, spirituality, advocacy, and community building. So this is a growing kind of movement, essentially, across the Communion and with wider partnerships where we're trying to broker funding for local projects. Here are just some of the things happening since the Lambeth Conference. So in Iowa, in Eswatini, Swaziland, and in Scotland, there you've got bishops giving out their trees at confirmation. The Zimbabwean example I've given already. and the Soto prayer walk and orchard creation they're doing with the Mothers Union. And every week we're getting more and more and more examples coming in as people explore the idea of the communion forest from their own perspective. Here's some more. So here's trees at confirmation in Brisbane in Australia, and in Ireland they've been giving out wildflower seeds at confirmation. There's saplings there at the Prism Mass in South Africa. And when the Bishop of Bath and Wells, who's our vice chair, was installed, every single one of the 800 guests that came to his installation was given a sapling to take home and plant. So it is about activities that are chosen locally and are locally and environmentally appropriate. So it might be about planting trees along boundaries on church land, restoring some wasteland in a town, creating a little city garden, or making your churchyard a wildlife corridor, especially for bees, for example, setting up a tree nursery, getting involved in a local conservation project. When I was over in the Philippines, I'm taken over to get involved in some mangrove planting, and advocating to prevent the destruction of a habitat. The possibilities are endless, and they all sit as a movement under this umbrella of the communion forest. So as I say, it's about conservation, it's about protection, it's about restoration. It's not just about tree planting, it's about growing. So you can start an initiative on church land or support one in the community. And it's about multiplying this as good news. And I love that picture of the Good News Garden that they have in the States. And I just wanted to call attention here. We were with, also in the Solomon Islands, the Franciscan brothers who've been increasingly concerned and working with Franciscans International on advocacy to try and protect the forest in the Solomon Islands from logging. And they've taken really interesting approaches. They've actually done a human rights analysis of what the impact of the logging of the forest is having on the local communities in terms of health, in terms of pollution, in terms of livelihoods, in terms of sexual abuse by the loggers of the local women, and so on and so on. And they actually took this research right up to the United Nations Commission for Human Rights in Geneva, when the Solomon Islands government was under what's known as the periodic review, and were able to bring through changes in government policy. So it's just an example of how the communion can be both local and a voice locally and a source of hope for action locally, but also can bring those voices together to impact globally. If you're interested, please do go to the Communion Forest website. It's got its own website linked to the Anglican Alliance, but it's full of stories of how to get engaged, webinars you might want to join. Every couple of months we have a pray, share and connect session just to hear from each other and to pray together. So there are lots of resources there, and you can sign up for a newsletter as well. And also we're looking at partnerships. I'm really excited about this one with a group called Restore, where you can map your own area that you want to plant, and the satellite imagery can come closer and closer to actually give you very, very detailed examples of where your forest cover may have shrunk or may have grown. And so it's a way of mapping over years, and they've got this mapping from 10 years back, so you can see what's been lost, but also over the coming years we can see how forests hopefully are being restored. So I just want to finish with this. Christiana Figueres, who was the lead of the UN FFC, is the climate change, climate change council with the UN. And she said this: when it comes to climate change, pollution and biodiversity loss, the vast majority of us have learned to react. Yes, it is terrible, but it is so complex and so big and so overwhelming. We feel we can't do anything to stop it. This learned response, Christiana Figueres said, is not only untrue, but it's fundamentally irresponsible. Know that you are incredibly lucky to be alive at a time when you can make a transformative difference to the future of all life on earth. You're not powerless. Your every action is suffused with meaning, and you're part of the greatest chapter of human achievement in history. She does a podcast called Outrage and Optimism. And I think that's a wonderful combination of ideas, that we can both be outraged at injustice and the sacrilege on the life of the earth, but also optimistic that we can, as humans, come together to make a difference. And so we treasure this song with the others, about striving to safeguard the integrity of creation, of God's creation, and sustaining and renewing the life of the earth. And we do that because we recognize that we are all interconnected, both as humanity of all faiths, creeds, colours, and races. We're all interconnected as one humanity. And we're also, as Christians, connected across the globe. And what we believe is that if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And we feel the pain of these people now in Myanmar, reflecting back on them again. But if one member is honoured, we rejoice together with it. So we rejoice with those Franciscan brothers who'd come from the villages in the Solomon Islands to bring their story and to see change through the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. So we are together, and how we use that voice, and you as Christians aware across the different churches that you're connected with, how do we use that voice together to be good news and to be, as Barbara said, to be God's church for God's world? Thank you.